In the 1930s, New York State used to fire teachers for not conforming to the height and weight charts because they were supposed to be modeling good behavior, and if you were too pudgy, good Lord, couldn't be teaching. I would have been in real trouble. So I think the point today is, one, we have lots of civil service protections that apply the same to teachers as to anybody else at the federal and state and local level, which provide a baseline of protection. So I think when we talk about doing away with tenure and making it easier to remove ineffective educators, we're not saying it's open season. What we're saying is the same rules ought to apply to teachers that apply to other public employees instead of this extra special layer of protection. As to how do you identify who's effective, here's where I'm usually I don't waffle. Here I'm going to waffle a bit. Because my answer is I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all right formula for 3.4 million teachers teaching 52 million kids. I think partly it depends on how that school is organized. In Wisconsin and Minnesota, there's teacher co-op schools, which have very intensive kind of routine collaborative observation. Toledo, Ohio, of course, pioneered some of this years ago. If you're doing this stuff, and if it's working, and if it's working to me means are the kids learning, and is the school doing reasonably well, then I have no desire to try to tell them prescriptively what's the right way to evaluate teachers. So, for instance, I'm pretty hesitant about state efforts in Colorado and Florida and Tennessee to write in simple-minded, value-added metrics that are going to be used to apply to all teachers across the state, and that is going to be the backbone of all teacher evaluation. What I'm actually in favor of is creating room for districts to do this, to create a focus on accountability and performance, to think about the different ways that we can actually gauge effectiveness. The Gates Foundation, under Tom Kane's leadership, is doing some terrific research on this right now. They're spending $350 million plus in 4 deep dive sites to figure out how do you use potentially feedback from students, how do you use feedback from parents, how do you use evaluation, whether that's external evaluation or peer evaluation or school leader judgment, and how do you use objective metrics. And what I'm in favor of is letting folks on the ground who are a lot closer to this than I am come up with the solutions that make sense for their districts and their states.
Hello. I was just wondering if it's possible to have a grassroots movement to ultimately get the kind of change that we're hoping for, because the unions and school districts are so institutionalized. And if there is going to be a grassroots movement, could it possibly be by picking off, some union members or teachers who can be part of that movement to help bring the change we need? That's
a terrific. So I think there's terrific questions. There's 2 things going on there in that question. I think one, and I tend to be in the decided minority on this. I don't believe grassroots movement is ultimately going to get this done. I call it the boil the sea strategy. That the Gates Foundation, if you remember, spent about $25 million with the Broad Foundation in 2008, running a campaign called End in 2008. And in 2006, there was an earlier effort with Oprah to get people to stand up for education. Well, we've been doing this for a long time. Problem is people are busy. There's a lot of other stuff they're supposed to care about. One interesting factoid I love, people talk about inconvenient truth as having been a watershed in public awareness on climate change. The year before Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth came out, 63% of Americans said that climate change was a very serious or serious problem. In 2009, 63% of Americans said climate change was a very serious or serious national problem. Problem is, it's hard to get, there was a bump there around the movie, but it's hard to get people to stay engaged. And in education, we're not talking about passing something. It's not about, if we're talking about engaging the grassroots to get a bill passed, then I'm in favor of it. Then I think, but I think what we need to do is we need to pick our targets. We've got to say, what are the things that we need to change? What are the elements of it? And then you can go out and mobilize people around that. You can mobilize people around their school. You can mobilize people around concrete things where you're asking them to do an action or 2 actions. If you just ask people to show up and care and march, they burn out. They will do that for their kid. They will do that for their kid. So schools that build in that parental involvement tend to have enormous success because you can get a lot of parents who are going to show up every week for 12 years when it's their kid. But they're not going to do it for everybody else's kid. We just got to be realistic. The teachers, same exact thing. We could sit here and yell all we want about how teachers should love kids more. And the unions will yell back that, people like me should love kids more. And I don't see I mean, that's a lot of love. It doesn't go anywhere. So for me, the answer is actually there's an outfit called Teach Plus, for instance, headed by a young lady named Celine Coggins up in Boston. They're now in Indianapolis. What they're doing is they're saying, look, we know from survey data that young teachers tend to feel differently about things like differentiated pay and about tenure than do veteran teachers. Now what happens is as they stay, that over time, those folks who feel different tend to leave the profession because they get frustrated, or they tend to look more like their older peers. Because once you've put 10 years in, you kind of get socialized. So the idea is, how do we latch into these folks who are real teachers, who are in classrooms, who feel differently than some of their more veteran colleagues, and make sure that both sides are in the conversation, so people don't get the idea that all teachers feel one way. So what Teach Plus does is exactly this. They're reaching out to young teachers who are interested in trying to figure out what's an evaluation system that teachers can feel good about. What's a system of pay that teachers can be comfortable with? What's a way to move away from last hired, first fired, which, by the way, the Indianapolis School Board adopted a modified proposal from these guys 3 or 4 weeks ago. So how do you get teachers at the table on both sides of the equation so that we start to actually have this argument on merits and it's not somehow the educators against the reformers? And I think that's exactly the way that we start to create those changes.
Mr. Hess, I compliment you on your focus on the dynamics of bringing teachers forward, finding excellence, and rewarding it. But along the way, it seems to me that you and others have to look closely at the students, too. And you made a comment in passing, which I think was something along the lines of taking into account the difficulty of educating particular students, something like that, which to me asks you to turn your attention to an incredibly difficult concept of trying to, recognizing that students are not fungible, some are far more challenging than others, and how do we begin to weave that into the thinking so we take account of where needs are greater or more difficult to meet?
No, that's an eminently fair point. And I'll just admit, one of the perils of being a policy guy is you tend to think about the things that we can change from a policy perspective. I teach, as was mentioned, a couple of these universities. I do a lot of leadership teaching people who are getting PhDs and such. And my background, I'm a PhD in political science. That's my training. And I always say, look, government can really do two things from a policy perspective. Government can tell you what you're not allowed to do, or it can give you money and try to attach strings. And after that, we're pretty much empty the toolkit. And so from that perspective, what I tend to focus on are the things where I feel I know something about, not the only things that are important. I mean, I think this whole question of how do we create home environments that are more supportive? How do you create community environments that are more supportive? How do we take into account the various... I don't mean to diminish those at all, but they, I think, are things that require a different kind of problem solving than I'm particularly well equipped to bring. So that's how I just tend to approach it. The second part is where that does obviously interface, is I want to see us create schools and school environments that are rewarded and encouraged to solve those kinds of problems and to make that part of their mission. And I want to see schooling and teaching where those challenges are recognized and acknowledged. I think value-added assessment is a real useful part in terms of that evaluation, because the whole notion is we're going to judge schools and teachers based on how far they move kids from where they started, rather than on some arbitrary endpoint that we've selected in a vacuum. But the other part, there's an outfit called the Seed School. It won an award from the Kennedy School a couple years ago. It's a grade 7 to 12 boarding school model. It's a charter school in Washington, D.C., and now one in Baltimore. The kids are with them 24/7. They build dormitories. 99% of the kids, parents never finished high school. All free and reduced lunch. All your urban kind of traditional at-risk population.